Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Falak Rizvi, roll number EP1770034. My topic is radial arm maze and my subtopic is behavioral neuroscience and spatial learning. So first I will discuss behavioral neuroscience. Behavioral neuroscience, also known as biological psychology, biopsychology, or psychobiology, and it is the application of the principles of biology of the study of physiological, genetic, and developmental mechanisms of behavior in humans and in other animals. In philosophy, Descartes suggested that the pineal gland, a midline unpaired structure in the brain of many organisms, was the point of contact between mind and body. So he proposed physical models to explain animals as well as human behavior. Behavior neuroscience deals with behavior and its neurobiological basis at all the levels, like from molecular biology and genetics to morphological, biochemical, neurochemical, electrophysiological, neuroendocrine, pharmacological, and neuroimaging studies. Now, what is the importance of behavior for neuroscience? As you know, the emphasis on behavior should be appreciated within biopsychology, given that behavior is a crucial evolutionary determinant of survival, and nervous system has evolved to meet the demands of interacting with and adapting to environment. So, nervous system has evolved to carry out two functions related to an organism's ability to interact with its environment. What are these two important functions? Number one, detecting energy changes, and number two, controlling movement. Research using PET, positron emission tomography scan, it usually compares brain activity in newborn to that of the adult or older children. And this has shown the most activity in the neonate's brain occur to the primary sensory and motor cortexes, thalamus and brainstem areas associated with the primitive reflexes seen in infants, but the activity in the frontal association cortex is relatively non-existent. Because as infants interact with their environment, more activity is seen in areas of the cortex that mediate these behaviors. The picture is showing primary sensory and motor cortexes. Now the neuroplasticity. The physical basis of the behavior plasticity is neuroplasticity, and neuroplasticity is the interactions between an organism's behavior and its environment cause changes in the structure of the brain. Now what means it means that neuroplasticity is the how the environment is causing changing in the structure of the brain. Now we have levels of behavioral causations. Both evolutionary and behavioral analysts have classified behavioral causations causative in terms of number one, ultimate causative, and number two, proximate causatives. And ultimate causatives is further divided into phylogenetics and ontogenetics. The process of phylogenetics, ultimate causation, is natural selection and is the main domain of evolutionary biology, and the process of ontogenetics, ultimate causation, are characterized by the selection of behavioral features of organisms during their lifetimes and are the domain of behavior analysis. And the proximate causation answers how questions and is the domain of function biology. Proximate causatives deals with how, मतलब कैसे ये चीज़ हुई. So, behavior is also caused proximately by changes in an organism's immediate environment. Stimuli that occur immediately prior to or contemporaneously with behavior are said to evoke the behavior. But a more complete picture is that stimuli evoke a neural changes that in turn evoke behavior. Examples I am quoting here is patellar reflex and 2+2 example. So first I will discuss patellar reflex. Patellar reflex is initiated by the tap on the patellar tendon, so which causes a stretched receptor in the quadriceps muscle to fire, and the sensory neuron synapses with a motor neurons in the lumbar region of the spinal cord, which send a nerve impulse back to the quadriceps muscle and causing it to contract, which is evident in leg extension. So the proximate causes of the contraction of the quadriceps muscles are the stimulus, the tap. When you tap, it is the stimulus and the sensory motor nerve firings. The ultimate cause of the reflex lies in the evolutionary history of the organisms in which it is found. And Second example I have is 2 plus 2. So 2 plus 2, when someone asks you what is 2 plus 2, initiates a chain of physiological events which as proximate causes produce the behavior of saying 4. The picture is showing the patellar reflex. So another way ultimate causes establish proximate causes, means ultimate causes establishes the proximate causes. So the structure of the brain then as set of proximate causes for behavior is co-determined by the ultimate causes of evolution by natural selection and conditioning. So in order to neuroscientists to fully understand how learned behaviors occur, they must first understand why it occurs. So from a behavior analytics, then behavioral neuroscientist examines the neurophysiological process that underlie established functional relationships between behavior and environment. That is, the behavioral laws can provide a roadmap for neuroscientists. So as Dunai and Palmer in 1994 wrote, analysis at the behavior level define the boundaries which the underlying physiological mechanisms must operate. Now the neural basis of the operant conditioning. So before we understand neural basis of operant conditioning, first we have to understand what is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a type of associative learning process through which the strength of a behavior is modified by reinforcement of punishment. For example, a child may want to open a box to get sweets inside, or it may learn to avoid touching a hot stove. Or we can take examples of rats which we have done in our lab, like mazes, T maze, Y maze, radial arm maze, and what rewards that they introduce to increase a behavior, but a punishment introduced to decrease a behavior. This is what operant conditioning is. So the neural basis of operant conditioning, the background work of this done by Olds and Milner, showing that electrical brain stimulation in certain neural pathways could function as powerful reinforce. And the neuroscientists have identified many of the quantitative, physiological and anatomical properties of these neural pathways. And research has shown that most reliable location of reinforcing electrical brain stimulation is a bundle of axons called the medial forebrain bundle that travel from the VTA of the midbrain to the forebrain. And moreover, dopaminergic neurons in the VTA and the forebrain are primarily involved in the reinforcement of the operant behavior. Obviously, we have dopamine antagonist and dopamine agonist. So dopamine antagonist block the effects of natural reinforcers like food, but dopamine agonist like amphetamine function as a powerful reinforcers, whether they are injected in the bloodstream as in self-administration preparations or directly into the brain as intracranial preparations. And research has shown that operant conditioning can alter the structure of the brain to include, number one, regulating the dynamics of the neural activity, and number two, changing synaptic terminals on primate motor neurons, and number three, altering dendritic branching and spine densities. And research on synaptic changes due to surge or synaptic changes due to operant conditioning, as well as susceptibility of the individual neurons to operant conditioning, suggests that the individual neuron could be an important function unit for positive reinforcement in the brain. Now, implication. What are the implications? So a science that deals with the objective and measurable subject matter behavior may offer neuroscientists a productive theoretical model with regard to so-called cognitive events. That an approach that idea is only indirectly with its subject matter. I'm getting example here is interpretation of listening, auditory and imagining as operant behavior. And in this I have different researches and have different approaches and suggestion like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and activation in Broca's area and premotor and motor cortex. So studies using TMS have shown that there is an increase in motor evoked potentials recorded from the tongue muscles and from the lip muscles during speech perception. That is when someone is said to be listening. And the next research supports the suggestion that when we are said to imagining, yani hearing, speech or music, we are behaving subvocally. So the studies has shown activation in Broca's area and the premotor and the motor cortexes when either listening or auditory imagining. The picture is showing TMS, and the next picture is showing brain activation during reading. So reader with dyslexia, this is a disease, shows less activation of Wernicke's area and the angular gyrus, and more activation of the Broca's area. Next subtopic is spatial learning. So spatial learning refers to the process by which an organism requires a mental representation of its environment. Spatial learning has found in both vertebrate and invertebrate species. Examples I have is in rodents, one of the most common means for assessing spatial learning is with different types of maze tasks, like what we have done in our lab. So where rats or mice use allocentric clues to guide an escape response, like finding a hidden platform in a water maze or to locate food, like in radial maze. So spatial learning is fundamental for survival in the topographically complex environments inhabited by humans and other animals, and the most important part of the brain involved is hippocampus, and it plays a central role in spatial cognition and is characterized by the high concentration of serotonin. So spatial memory includes the ability to learn the topographic configuration of environments, to locate objects, to recall previously encountered locations, and to navigate with environment. And our many day-to-day activities, even our animals, depend on the spatial learning, and particularly the ability to process and remember spatial descriptions of environment has been linked to certain types of learning disabilities. And Alzheimer disease, it's a major thing that in clinical level, the study of spatial learning is of particular significance to several neurological disorders such as dementia of the Alzheimer's types, where impairment in spatial cognition are the central failure, and spatial memory is largely mediated by mesial temporal areas. Neuroanatomy of spatial learning and memory. Research on spatial memory has consistently implicated a hippocampal brain network consisting of the hippocampus proper, the parahippocampal cortexes, fornix, parietal cortex, anterior thalamic nuclei, frontal cortex, and the stratum. And researches are done, and they elaborate that grid cells were found in the rats entorhinal cortex, which is a chief gateway into the hippocampus. And what they does, they usually generate coordinate system that allow exact positioning and pathfinding. So together with other cells entorhinal cortex that recognize direction of the head of the animal and border of the environment, head direction cells. So lesions and stimulation of the hippocampus in the non-human primate, Parkinson, and rodents were shown to impair spatial learning and memory. Similarly, in humans, medial temporal regions, especially on the right side. So serotonin and 5-HT1A receptor. 5-HT1A receptor is the main receptor that involved and clustered in the several nuclei along the midline of the brainstem. And the most prominent of which are raphenuclei, and the axons of these neurons innervate almost all regions of CNS, and thus affect the variety of behavior. So we have subtypes, and 7 subtypes of 5-HT, and termed as 5-HT17 and 5-HT1A receptors are mainly concentrated in the limbic system, particularly the hippocampus, lateral septum, amygdala, incingulate, and entorhinal cortexes. And in both hippocampus and dorsal raphe, 5-HT1A receptors activation results in neural hyperpolarization. So through this, the interaction with G protein and opening of the potassium channels. 5-HT1A and spatial learning and memory. Now, what is the link between these three? So evidence to support a role of 5-HT1A receptor in spatial learning and memory comes from the variety of experimental methods that I have done earlier. So including mouse knockout models, direct receptor activation and blockade, neurotransmitter PET imaging, genetic studies, and manipulation of 5-HT concentrations. Knockout mouse models, and it usually studies using genetically modified animals, and particularly those of single gene deletions in knockout mouse, provide the strongest evidence for the role of 5-HT1A receptor in learning and memory. And the lack of 5-HT1A receptors is specifically associated with spatial learning and memory impairments. The studies done by Wolf in 2004 demonstrated similar impairment in learning and retention of the Morris water maze in young adult 5-HT1 in knockout mouse, but not in aged 5-HT1 in knockout mouse. So the author suggested that the reduced effect of the mutation is aged animals possibly reflect the lower efficacy of autoreceptors due to aging or prevalence of hippocampal heteroreceptors. Now 5-HT1A receptor stimulation, obviously 5-HT1A agonist and antagonist modulate 5-HT neurotransmission and have shown to directly alter spatial learning and performance. So typically antagonist found to impair spatial learning, whereas agonist found to ameliorate to the antagonist induced spatial defects or allowed normal performance. Example I am quoting is 8-hydroxy-2-diene-propyloaminotetraline. Short form is 8-OHTPAT. These are references for behavioral neuroscience and for spatial learning research articles. Thank you.